Welcome once again to our studies in the book of Judges. And we come today to a long passage, chapter 10 verse 17 to chapter 12 verse 15, a section of the book which is largely devoted to the life of one person, of Jephthah. So it will be helpful to have a Bible open in front of you, and of course there will be questions at the end for personal or group study. The last passage that we studied together, chapter 10 verse 6 to 16, concluded with the reader on tiptoe. How will the Lord show that he could bear Israel's misery no longer? These chapters describe how the Lord raised up Jephthah and his successors Ibzan, Elon and Abdon to restore the people to himself. The Lord's compassion seems to have outworked itself in his galvanizing the people to action. For 18 years the Israelites had been passively accepting their situation, presumably appealing to their helplessness in the face of their enemies. But now a spirit of resistance is in the air. Gathered at Mizpah, they decide that action is required. The people of God are always, of course, helpless to improve their situation if the Lord is not with them. Yet this is no excuse for inactivity. Thus, newly awakened to the fact that God is not honoured by their situation, and when they suffer reproach, they get moving. There is something unspiritual about our unwillingness to plan ahead as the Lord's people. Of course, we're utterly dependent on him, and he can always act in an unexpected and unplanned way, as he did with Gideon. But looking to him, we are expected to give thought and planning in attempting to undertake his work. But who are the people to ask to lead them? There was in fact only one candidate who was obviously equipped for the task, Jephthah. Like David, later he had to learn to fend for himself without the support of family and clan. He was probably a mercenary soldier of some sort, but he's described as a mighty warrior. He clearly had gifts of leadership for others gathered around him. However, he was illegitimate, the son of a prostitute. We're actually told that his father was Gilead, and this suggests that any man in the region of Gilead could have been his father. Moreover, the fact that his mother was a prostitute may suggest that she was not an Israelite, since prostitution was forbidden to Israel. And so it was that born and bred Gileadites had therefore expelled him from the tribe, lest they lose out by his taking a share in the tribal lands that they believed were theirs. Paradoxically, this experience of trial seems, as with so many, to have been the making of him. When he appears in the story, he's already a skilled diplomat and soldier. He was also a godly man who knew the dealings of God with his people in the past very well. Thus the people who had rejected him in the past, when they were more occupied with their selfish interests, had to, as we say, eat humble pie, and to do so before Jephthah in asking him to lead them. He was, of course, understandably careful before accepting their invitation. He was also anxious to point out that if victory over the Ammonites followed, it would be because the Lord had given them to him. But can God be in all this diplomacy? The answer is a resounding yes. Once the Lord had been moved to compassion, the deliberations, plans, strategies and diplomacies that the people took were seen to be ordered by him to achieve his purposes. There's a comfort in knowing that the Lord can use such disadvantaged people as Jephthah, and that this is not the most important lesson of the story. Nor is the fact that Jephthah was, like Jesus who followed him, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Rather, the lessons we're to learn are that when we return to the Lord, it is often those whose leadership we've rejected that we must return to. Above all, we're to place ourselves once more under the authority of God and his will. This passage is, however, sanguine about the harsh realities in leading the reformation of God's people. And Jephthah found 3 steps necessary to bring about the restoration of the Lord's people. First of all, he began with diplomacy. But he was no mere politician. What he set forth was the will of the Lord. He urged the Lord's enemies to be subject to his will. Several note that his argument is carefully crafted. Having established the basis for the Ammonite hostilities, he replied first of all by an appeal to history. Israel had not, as claimed, taken Ammonite territory. The land north of the Arnon had been Amorite when Israel entered Canaan, and had been won from Sihon, the Amorite king. Moreover, Sihon's territory had been given to Israel by the Lord. This also reads like a gentle but firm threat. If the Lord has done this once, he can do it again, especially to those who are usurpers. The second part of the argument is an appeal to theology. It's possible but unlikely that Jephthah believed in the reality of non-Israelite gods. But the force of his argument is rather, the Lord has given us our land to live in. Rest content with the territory your gods have apportioned to you. The third stage of his argument is an appeal to precedent. If in fact there's no legitimate claim to the territory in question, but the true reason for Ammonite aggression is hatred of Israel, then, suggests Jephthah, why not follow the precedent of Balak, who had stopped short of outright warfare? Finally, Jephthah offers an argument from silence. If there was a genuine grievance, how was it that nothing had been mentioned about it during the previous 300 years? Sadly, the king of Ammon paid no attention, and since his diplomacy had failed, Jephthah found it necessary to wage outright war against those who had proved intransigent. Empowered by the Spirit of the Lord gave the Ammonites into his hands. 18 years of misery were wiped out in one short military action when the Lord was on the side of his people. But we need to note one other incident associated with this military campaign. Jephthah found, as so many have done since, that the greatest enemy when undertaking the Lord's work is often the enemy within. We've already encountered the Ephraimites. They liked to think that they were the leading tribe. They resented anyone else usurping the position that they believed was rightfully theirs. In Gideon's day they had nevertheless fought on the side of the people of God. However, their pride had apparently grown ever greater in the meanwhile, and they refused to support Jephthah. Thus Jephthah says, although I called, you didn't save me, you wouldn't help. In fact, they had already crossed the Jordan from their tribal territory east of the river, as the sequel shows, and had come up to fight. However, if they couldn't have the dignity they thought they deserved, they intended to do all they could to bring down the Lord's anointed. Hence the trumped-up charges, which manifestly didn't ring true. They didn't need to, of course. Any excuse would do. All this explains Jephthah's very different response from that of Gideon. The Ephraimites, by their rebellion, had effectively declared themselves to be the enemies of the Lord. They could no longer be tolerated. No longer the Lord's people, they had to be exterminated, just like the Canaanites before them. Now, Numbers chapter 26, verse 37 tells us that Ephraim numbered 32,000 men when Canaan was entered. The present event took place no more than 300 years later. Thus, to lose 42,000 men must have been a virtual wipeout. Indeed, the power of Ephraim was destroyed for generations to come. How often have those who have sought to restore the Lord's people encountered the same difficulties? They've proclaimed the Lord's will, have had to fight against the powers that the ungodly have gained over the church. But they've found that the greatest enemy is the enemy within, those who like to think of themselves as the people of God, but who show by their conduct that they know nothing of the genuine spiritual life. Sadly, when such radical action is required, we often have cold feet. But there is a time when we must act for the glory of God and the unity of his people, when we can no longer tolerate ungodliness in the midst of the people of God. Sadder still is the fact that we can see that the overall decline during the period of the Judges is such that the people are beginning to speak differently and to act independently to the ultimate destruction of the people of God, or at least a substantial portion of them. Unity lived out in obedience to God's will and under the leadership that he gives is alone able to stem this self-destructive urge. The story of Jephthah is difficult to interpret, but nowhere is this more so than in the final incident, and Christians are divided over whether a human sacrifice takes place here. On balance, this seems unlikely, and the reasons I offer are the following. First, Jephthah's vow clearly had in mind another human being. The phrase "whatever comes out of my house" is best translated by "whoever," and it's therefore not likely to have been a family pet or some other animal that is in view. But human sacrifice was never practiced in Israel and was strictly forbidden in the law, with which Jephthah shows considerable familiarity. Jephthah would have acted entirely out of character to have had a human sacrifice in mind. Secondly, the whole emphasis upon the mourning of his daughter is upon her perpetual virginity. "I will never marry," she says, not her premature death. This is strange if she was to be offered up as a human sacrifice. Thirdly, there's no need to interpret the reference to burnt offering literally. It's quite possible it had a metaphorical usage and referred to something wholly devoted to the Lord. Since they were under the Old Covenant women, such as Anna, who devoted themselves to service in or around the tabernacle and temple, and in Anna's case seemed to have foregone marriage or remarriage, it seems likely that Jephthah's daughter may well have been so devoted to the Lord. Fourthly, while recognizing that biblical narrative does not always make its judgments clear upon events that are described, this story would surely have contained some veiled criticism of Jephthah had he so blatantly acted against the law of God. Moreover, it's difficult to understand how the Lord could use such a person as the deliverer of his people, although of course the Lord is a God of amazing grace. Thus, though there are those who offer other conclusions, it would seem most likely that Jephthah made a foolish vow in which he pledged the first person who came out from his house to the service of the Lord. He must have known the risk he took, that it might be his daughter. Perhaps he thought this might increase the power of the vow. His grief is understood when we realize that since she was his only child, he thereby removed the possibility that his name would live on in Israel. This was the ambition of every Israelite man, especially one who, like Jephthah, was the son of nobody. Sadly, Jephthah was eventually buried in the town of Gilead, an anonymous place with no family connections. The folly of the vow was compounded by the fact that it indicated that Jephthah had unworthy views of the Lord. He is a God of grace who is not manipulated, as Jephthah sought, by the vows of men or women. Vows are to be a response to grace, not a means to achieving it. And yet, despite his foolishness, he was not willing to break his vow, and his daughter was willing to submit. Though we might consider that there were grounds for evading the implementation of his vow, Jephthah went through with it. He was resolved to go through with what he had promised. His was a dedicated, if misguided, faith, which still challenges us. So Jephthah was a hero of the faith, as we're told in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32, but he was a flawed hero. Yet of all the judges he was perhaps the greatest, for he did not fall to the depths that either Gideon or Samson did. And considerable comfort lies here. We all have our faults and our unworthy views of God, yet he does not reject us as flawed vessels or seconds. Whether our tasks are great or menial, he will readily use us if, with all our limitations, we seek his honour. Once again, we're given cause to marvel that in this solemn book there are such testimonies to the love and mercy of God to men and women such as us. May this mercy and love stir us up to faithfully put into practice the more difficult aspects of its message. Finally, this section of Judges concludes with the brief references to three other minor judges, Ibzan, Elon and Abdon. Little of significance is said about these men, However, after Jephthah, who had led Israel for 6 years, a further period of 25 years of peace followed. In addition, the verses clearly imply that Ibzan was an older man with a large family. These things are invariably regarded as a blessing from God in the Old Testament, and indicative of such an absence of strife as enabled children to mature, to be married, and to grow old. We're also told that Ibzan carefully married his children in such a way as to establish a web of relationships with other clans in Israel. This suggests that his particular contribution to Israel was to seek to ensure that the fragmentation of the nation, reflected in the previous paragraphs, was overcome. We cannot be sure about his success. Some commentators note that there's no reference to there being peace during the periods that these 3 men ruled. There may have been no enemies without, but it can be suggested there was no real peace within the nation either. Abdon is described in terms which suggest similar conclusions to those we've offered for Ibzan. However, there is one ominous note. He came from and was buried in an area of the land sufficiently dominated by the Amalekites as to be described as their hill country. But this reminds us that Israel was far from realizing its true calling, and it prepares us for the events of Samson's life which follow. There we shall discover Israel helpless, even in the midst of that territory, the hill country, that one might have thought could be reasonably secured for themselves.